In yesterday's movie math, many of you had the same question. Why does a movie like The Batman need to make $1 billion? Well, I'll explain it to you. Because it's vital to understanding the blockbuster business in Tinseltown. And some of the big questions that are coming up with streaming being such a big disruptor. All right, so Matt Reeves' Batflick cost around $200 million to make. The range is $185 to $200, but we're going to put it at $200. And it can cost anywhere from $100 to $200 million to advertise a big blockbuster. So we'll put it at $150, just to be kind to Matt Reeves and the Batman. Now, the rule of thumb in Hollywood is that when all is said and done, at the end of the day, a studio gets back about half of the global box office. I know that movies are more front-loaded these days, but still, this is the rule of thumb that's used for, third-party evaluations. Nobody knows for sure what happens, on the accounting departments and studios, which is why you always want part of the gross, not the net, because there's usually never any net. People are still complaining about this, in fact. Anyway, this would mean that the Batman needs to hit $700 million just to break even, and it's now only just approaching $600 million. So right off the bat, you can see that when studios spend big money to make and advertise these blockbusters, they need to make big money in order to see a profit. And it's why you're seeing some discussion about how much money should be spent on a blockbuster, what's responsible, and if a franchise isn't performing it the way that it should it be dialed back in terms of what the studio is spending on it. Remember that I know that it's hard sometimes for you to remember because all you care about is whether or not you were entertained. But Hollywood is a business. Most studios or their parent companies have shareholders, and they have to perform. The company has to perform. So if the Batman finishes with $700 to $800 million, which is what some of you are guessing, and which is what's seeming to be a more and more realistic estimate, as we see the Batman's box office picture come into focus, well, that wouldn't be great for Warner Brothers, to be honest with you. By the way, this is why when a smaller, less expensive picture joins the $1 billion club, like Joker or the first Deadpool, that's why the studios are just so over the moon, because it's nothing but money. Money, 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 money. And that's the job of the studio, to balance how much it's worth to spend on something. Like at what point are you just burning money? Or because up to a certain point, the cash that you're investing will be returned to you because audiences enjoy the spectacle so much. And this is why it's so important to hit release dates and why movies are now rushed a little bit, blockbusters, because it's just so important to get that revenue. Now back to the Batman. While it's not great if Warner Brothers only breaks even, it's not game over either, because we're just talking about the theatrical release here. There's still a ton of money to be made in the ancillary market. I mean, No Time to Die basically just broke even, and of course that's partially to blame due to the pandemic, and I think people keep that in mind when they look at the numbers. But at the same time, Bond just found itself sold to, Amazon, right? So it's tough out. I mean, or at least the production, the deal. So it's tough out there. Maybe that wouldn't have happened if No Time to Die had made more money. And so, but I mean, many businesses have been affected by the pandemic. So, you can see that there's a ripple effect, even just beyond the movie that you are considering. All right, so there's money for the Batman to make, and, James Bond too, in the ancillary market. That's, when it goes to, first, when it's ancillary market encompasses so many things. Just I'll recap for those of you who aren't familiar with the term. It's when it plays on an airplane, when it plays in a hotel room, when it is available for digital purchase or rental. Then there's the pay one streaming window, the pay two streaming window. And, if a studio has a streaming service, the subs that it drives for the service when it becomes available. So that's all the ancillary market. Then there's also merchandise, although I don't know how much merch would come out of the Batman. Something for Matt Reeves to consider. Theme park experiences. Warner Brothers has a lot of partners, even though they aren't too big in the theme park space themselves. Not only streaming with Batman being on there, that's the ancillary market, but how about the spin-offs, like the Penguin show that they've just greenlit direct-to-series for HBO Max? That's a benefit. And then, of course, the hope that the sequel will do even better, especially if Matt Reeves takes to heart some of the lessons from this movie. Maybe it was too long. Maybe it was too dark. Maybe it didn't have enough action. Maybe it does need a flashier villain for Pattinson to go up against. I'm not necessarily saying we need to have the Joker yet again, but Matt Reeves has been saying he wants to do Mr. Freeze. Is Mr. Freeze enough? Do you need to do, the classic two-villain combo that Hollywood loves so much, which usually ends up with one of those villains being shortchanged? But maybe they do it to make sure you go see the movie. These are all things for, not only for Matt Reeves to consider, but for the studio to consider, and for us to consider when we try to understand the choices that are being made. And then, of course, we have to be fair that just like COVID was a problem with No Time to Die, it did end up hurting the Batman overseas in particular. And then the 45-day window, I think, is a problem. And we're going to talk about the 45-day window a bit more towards the end of this video. Now, of course, Batman Begins, as people like to point out, couldn't even break $400 million globally, or with a $150 million budget, so Warner Brothers lost money on that movie. Yet The Dark Knight, where Nolan did make adjustments, 3 years later, hit $1 billion. Changed not only the Batman franchise, but the whole comic book movie game. It was a game changer. And that was for $185. So they even gave Nolan more money, which is fascinating considering he lost money for them with the first film. So I'm sure that Warner Brothers has the same hopes for Matt Reeves's and Robert Pattinson's sequel. They're like, it's gonna, if this is your Batman Begins, imagine where your Dark Knight could be, considering, the Batman is, this is a solid performance. So that's one side of it. These big expensive blockbusters need to join the $1 billion club in order to turn a profit, and you don't want to just make a couple of bucks. You want to see a solid, considerable investment, return on your investment. And so that's why, you would see if it hits $1 billion, that's only really $300 million profit. And I know you might be like, only, but you have to remember that's what just pays for maybe not even 2 movies budgets for new blockbusters. You have to remember the amount of money that Warner Brothers is spending. And also for advertising. If they make $300 million, that's basically a slightly cheaper new blockbuster in the advertising for it. All right, and they have operating expenses. All right, then there's image. So you have profit on one side and image on the other. The industry follows the box office. Now fans follow the box office. There's $1 billion club. We put a name on it. When movies break records, studios, producers, directors, the media, fans share those milestones on social media, which also in turn, by the way, helps drive profit because someone goes, maybe I should see that again, or maybe I should see it for the first time. It's so popular. All right, so Batman movies also, you have to remember, have made $1 billion in the past. The audience is there. So when a Batman movie does not make $1 billion, that means there's been a loss. There is a loss in audience, a loss in momentum. And that's concerning to everyone who's invested in that franchise, from the studio to the talent to the shareholders to the fans who are emotionally invested, right? Although even fans are getting invested these days, buying stock in studios and AMC, you're in the game too. Also, in today's ultra-competitive movie market where franchises compete and have loyal fandoms, when Spider-Man No Way Home makes almost $2 billion and the Batman can't even reach $1 billion, and they're in the same COVID situation. Spider-Man No Way Home is in an even worse situation. It makes it look like DC Batman isn't still on the same level as Spider-Man and Marvel. That's not a good look. Marvel and DC have always been peers in the comic book marketplace. So for one to be so far behind the other is embarrassing. The MCU consistently is able to hit $1 billion. Not always, but pre-pandemic, with just a few exceptions. Peyton Reed, how does he keep getting work? Marvel has consistently been getting their movies in the 800 million range, close to $1 billion. That's amazing. Even when they don't hit $1 billion, they're close. Doctor Strange is one of the other movies to fall short, one of the few films to fall short, which is another thing to factor in when we consider how Doctor Strange 2 might do at the box office. Is Doctor Strange not as popular a superhero as the other MCU superheroes? Does he somehow not quite connect in the same way? Even though we might love him, you have to look at the box. I mean, we all love Ryan Gosling, and yet that guy consistently underperforms. You have to take a look at what's the pattern. That's why box office is studied so meticulously within the industry and has been so far since it existed, to look for these patterns. This is the best evidence as to where the audience is and what they're interested in. Now, of course, there is always, I think, this is a side note, with streaming services coming into play and technology, some of these creative decisions are starting to be left up to machines, to artificial intelligence, who use these clues in box office or viewing metrics to make decisions on what should be made creatively. I can understand that, but I think that you can never underestimate that lightning in a bottle creative choice that brings back something new. So I'd hate to lose that. I think it's important to have both elements, and you have some very safe bets based on what the algorithms have told you, and then you have some Hail Marys that are lightning in a bottle that sometimes can deliver fantastic dividends. All right, so anyway, the MCU, Spider-Man movies now consistently hit $1 billion. The Jurassic World movies also consistently hit $1 billion. Star Wars, the new Disney Star Wars movies, with the exception of Solo, which is why that was such a disaster, they consistently hit $1 billion. And you can be sure that with Harry Potter and James Bond having each hit $1 billion once, the powers that be on each franchise are trying to get back to that level, to be billion-dollar franchises once again. Because there's a lot of billion-dollar franchises, and if you aren't one of them, what's wrong with you? Why can't you perform at the same level as your peers? Studios need billion-dollar franchises to be their economic engines. They pump money not only into the studio to make more of that franchise, but to be able to, that's what pays for the other movies that you're watching and the other television shows. That pays for the operating costs so that the studio can exist. It's very, very important. Now, Disney is firing on all cylinders. Every division at Disney is able to deliver billion-dollar movies. And their stock is still down, which, expectations, it's tough. It's tough business. But Disney's doing very, very well. And Warner Brothers, with their brands, should be competitive with Disney. Yet, in its current state, DC has only $2 billion entries versus what Marvel is pumping out. And so there's an urgency and importance to get DC even somewhat back to the same level as the other big comic book franchise in Hollywood, Marvel. And DC can hit $1 billion. Christopher Nolan built Batman into a $1 billion franchise, and now it's not a $1 billion franchise. So again, there's that feeling of loss. It's not even a feeling. There's a loss. The movies used to make $1 billion. They're not making $1 billion now. That has to change. I'm not saying it, the Batman's getting close, but it's got to, if it doesn't reach $1 billion on the sequel, then we have a real problem. In 2008, The Dark Knight made $1 billion, and Iron Man made just about half that. These two brands hit their stride the exact same year, and yet look at the difference in where they are today. And when you have a film that critics and fans love, like The Batman, it's disappointing that even that can't perform on the same level as Marvel at the box office. So then there becomes an even bigger question of what is it going to take to level DC back up to Marvel's level if The Batman can't do it? What is the problem? Is it the problem with the movie? Like I just listed some of the things that maybe Matt Reeves can take to heart. Is it an image issue for the entire franchise? Is it an image issue for DC overall as a brand? Is it the studio? I think these are all scary questions. David Zaslav, who's coming on board, is going to have to ask. Sometimes maybe the people who run the studio don't want to ask these questions, but it's important that someone asks them. It's important that someone asks these questions. The mainstream has gone from cheering on Batman and Superman to Iron Man and Captain America, which is an incredible accomplishment on the part of Kevin Feige. To replace those characters is mind-boggling in the mainstream psyche. But of course, the MCU has now retired Iron Man and Captain America, at least for now, which is why it's so fascinating to see what Marvel is evolving into and if they can do it. Plus, to see how their connected story benefits them as a safety net through this evolution. Not to say that Marvel doesn't have its own missteps. They do. The Eternals was a major misstep. But, still, also, we're holding Marvel to the same standards. It's not lost on any of us. It's the Sony Marvel movie that hit $1 billion. And now that's why Doctor Strange 2's box office is so important, because it's going to be just as embarrassing for them image-wise if they can't perform on par. And it's their brand, basically. So that's all very important. Also, since Warner Brothers is doing something so different with their DC movies, they're running it so differently, the way to determine who's running it better is box office, among many things, but I think box office is the most paramount. So the Batman not hitting $1 billion is yet another piece of evidence that DC, even with the changes that they've been making, still isn't operating and is run as well as Marvel. So with all this in mind, this is why also studios need to think very carefully about shortening the theatrical window to 45 days. Because a movie's theatrical box office has historically been what drives it for the rest of its run. In the ancillary market, as a franchise for the next entries, it drives it financially, and it drives it in terms of its image. You're always thinking in Hollywood about finances and image. And don't kid yourself, image directly impacts finance, which is why anybody cares about it. At the end of the day, it's always about money because this is a business. Now, Disney has experimented with doing different things with the theatrical window. They've put some, particularly in animation, some movies have gone directly to Disney Plus, like Turning Red, right? And then some have had a shortened window, like Encanto, which was just 30 days. Very brilliantly played with the holiday window, Thanksgiving to Christmas. And that's turned out incredible for them. Encanto is a huge streaming hit. But for instance, with the first 2 Frozen movies making $1 billion, would Disney touch the theatrical window for Frozen 3? That's where things get interesting. Because I think, Encanto Moana is also a streaming juggernaut, and that's box office was, medium compared to other Disney animated movies. So I think they might have thought that Encanto was another Moana, and so far that has proven, I think it's more of a sensation, quite frankly, but it is more in that ballpark. But a blanket 45-day window across the board, which is what Warner Brothers has decided to do for 2022, always making the wrong decision. First, in 2021, everything was going day and date to HBO Max. Now they've decided in 2022, everything's a 45-day window. They've just, for some reason, they want to make these blanket decisions instead of making a decision for each project. I don't know if the 45-day blanket decision was a good idea. I think for the Batman, it was not. I think when we look at the box office, because right now the Batman is pacing ahead of other movies that ended up doing better, it's undercutting it. Or is this a problem? I mean, how much do streaming services bring in? And right now, unlike a movie where there's talent participation and investors, people who invested to help pay for the movie get a cut, right now, when you pay your streaming subscription fee, that goes all to the studio. So they like that money more. They don't have to share that money with anybody. They don't have to share it with a movie theater. They don't have to share it with an actor or a director. They don't have to share it with a film finance company. It's just all for them. They love it. And another reason they don't have to share it is that, you're subscribing to a service. You're not buying an a la carte ticket for content. So they're like, I don't know what your cut would be. That's why streaming deals pay more up front, because there's no back end. And since it's a direct transaction with the studio, and again, there is no third party like a movie theater or a digital company that sells digital movies, which is where, you do not buy digital movies directly from the studio, at least not for now. You did when you bought it on Disney Plus, by the way, or bought it. You didn't really own it. But you unlocked it. But anyway, these numbers are hidden from the public. There's no third party to kind of like keep an eye on it. And that's a whole other conversation, which Scarlett Johansson started to have with Disney about Black Widow. And rather than have that conversation publicly in court, Disney decided they were better off to just pay her, which gives you an idea of how much money is beneath the surface of streaming. And that's why unions in Hollywood are starting to go on strike for deals that cut them in on that. Fascinating. So, but back to Blockbusters and why they need to join the $1 billion club. I told you today it's all about the $2 billion club. Right now, it's just like a movie's supposed to hit the century mark, or like, mid-range movies are supposed to at least hit the century mark. Right now, a blockbuster really needs to hit $1 billion. And now the big accomplishment where it's special is if it can get to 2. So I hope that this gives you a better understanding of the situation, and also how studio-owned streaming services are complicating the situation quite a bit. All right, share your own thoughts down below, subscribe today, and of course, as always, you can check out some more videos right now.